Another attempt to take down the $100,000 top prize over in the FFPC Superflex Best Ball Tournament. And as we have done so far, Shawn, we have drafted in these mainly against the RotoViz Overtime listeners. Any other drafts that have not been live drafts for myself personally have been slow drafts, but I am diving into this format, putting as many tickets in as I can. One of my favorite formats in the entire fantasy football industry. $35 to enter. The website is myffpc.com. And as I mentioned, the slow draft's underway too. Something about the slow draft, Shawn, that kind of exciting. You wake up every day, you have a couple of picks, you'll be on the clock. It's a nice time to have something to look forward to each day. So I'm looking forward to it, but we are going to have a lot of picks here, 20 in fact, as we pick from the 4th spot, as I mentioned, against the RotoViz OT community, which I think sometimes makes it a little bit more challenging than I like the picks I get in those slow drafts, Shawn, that come along. The one question I have is we are at the 104. We have, I don't believe, had that spot in these drafts based on ADP and rankings and so on and so forth and how the draft may play out here for us. We are on the clock now, so you have the floor. But I was going to say, with your rankings, for example, on the site, CJ Stroud, Patrick Mahomes come in as 3 and 4 for you. We haven't really been drafting quarterbacks at the back end of the first round, but we have an early slot here. Is CJ Stroud the way you want to go with this one? I think that'll be a fun start if you want to go that way.
Yeah, I mean, I would probably go with Stroud or Bijan Robinson or Bryce Hall.
Yeah, I was thinking about going with Christian McCaffrey if he made it to us at that particular point. I think that we go with Stroud. One of the things I've talked a good bit about when I've been doing live drafts with, Blair or Tom or whoever we've been doing them with on the RotoViz YouTube channel, you can get access to certain players, in those spots when you're in the 8, 9, 10, 11 spot, but you don't always get that many spots at the front end of the draft, and maybe you don't get access to Stroud as often. I don't think in this Superflex contest yet I've got him in any single draft, so I'm kind of excited to set a team up because I am very interested in all of his receiving options. So we might be able to build that direction. Usually when we kick these off for people listening, we start off and we jump on, we're ready to go. And usually then when we get to like the point where we're talking about the pick, Shawn likes to just throw a landmine in there as to who we're going to draft. So CJ Stroud is a fun start there. In this format, Shawn, we have talked about how the running backs are that little bit more valuable. It's obviously PPR format, but you're also in a situation where it's super flex, and one of the flex spots that you would normally have at the FFPC website turns into the quarterback spot or the super flex option rather than an additional roster spot. So whereas we would usually be thinking about starting 4 wide receivers in the regular FFPC formats, and this one, if your quarterbacks are in the lineup, you're likely starting 3 at maximum. And then you have the possibility as well of starting multiple tight ends if you have enough of those on the roster, because it is tight end premium as well. So lots of ways you can play it. Bryce Hall, Bijan Robinson would both be fun picks to add to a roster like this. But one of the things as well we've talked about is if you can get that elite quarterback to start off the draft and then really push the position then beyond that, it sets you up in a nice way as well. So I don't really think there was a wrong answer there for who we would draft when you have that early draft spot, but pretty excited to start off with CJ Stroud there. So far, the draft going Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, Christian McCaffrey, Stroud, Mahomes, Lamb, Lamar Jackson. So somebody at the back end of this draft is going to get Bryce Hall, Bijan Robinson for nice kickoffs to their board. But the fun thing with this format too, Shawn, there is so many players, because of the Superflex format, those opening 2-round picks are always fun to make based on how it sets up. But CJ Stroud, how are you feeling about that pick?
Well, you're never going to get me to say anything bad about CJ Stroud. I think he has a chance.
Is he going to break the touchdown record this year?
I think he's got a chance, right? I mean, I don't think people realize how good those 3 receivers are. When people are telling me that, like, Stephon Diggs is a bad pick, like Stephon Diggs, the guy who's been like the 4th or 5th best receiver in the NFL over the last 5 years, in rounds 3, or like in this format column, he goes at the end of round 6.
Yeah, wide receiver 24. Are you telling me he's not going to be a top 24 wide receiver this year?
Yeah. So what happened last season is that Nico Collins was very good. And we now have reason to believe that Collins is good. But most of that, or not most of it, but a big chunk of that washes back on CJ Stroud. Tank Dell, when they were playing at the same time, was even better. Right now,
Tank
I think
Dell's
that Dell
numbers
is
last season are pretty crazy.
they're insane. They're insane. And so, I mean, you're going to draft Patrick Mahomes over. I mean, that's where it is by ADP. We did take a guy who has an ADP of 8th, right? So you're saying you can get Robinson, you can get Hall at the end. That's a way to play these picks at the back of the round. My thought would be that one of the things you can do, right, is you have this 4th pick like we had. You put the running back in there. You're going to have a unique team. You're going to have a chance to get potentially somebody better in round 3 than most of the Bijan and Breece Hall teams have. One of the things that we see in the heat map, and again, if this is a contest that interests you, the RotoViz tools are absolutely fantastic for beating it. You pull up the Best Ball Win Rate Explorer, you go to the positional heat map tab, you can look at the QB position, and outside of the first 4 picks, it's been catastrophic to draft a QB early until you get basically into round 4 again. I mean, you're talking about a lot of consecutive selections where you don't want to pick a QB historically. That doesn't mean that we're going to get that same type of result in 2024. But one of the problems we have, even when we take a CJ Stroud, is that, I mean, that's a pick that's going in that range by ADP that has been the quarterback landmine range. We take a guy who has production that is predicated on hitting big as a passer. Those numbers are mitigated just slightly in this Superflex format over the regular format. So, you know, there's some hubris and there are some structural reasons that the Stroud pick is questionable. Colm, we're going to need him to go out and have that type of season, that epic, you know, peak Peyton Manning, Drew Brees, Aaron Rodgers, Patrick Mahomes type of passing season to make this pick work out.
We are, but that is like, you know, it's easy to like just say that's
Colm, you're like, that's what we're betting on history. So
yeah, no, but it's like, you know, the trajectory, a player who comes in and does things as a rookie that we haven't seen from many players in NFL history. And then you're having that trajectory of him taking a step forward. You're having the players having another year in their career. You're having Stephon Diggs coming in as another passing option for him. Like everything is pointing in the trajectory that is on the horizon, or that is in the range of outcomes here. So when we're looking at the players that you'd be willing to take with your top 4 or 5 picks in this at the quarterback position, he's one of the ones that I am willing to do it on. And I know you mentioned the ADP being 8th. Obviously, then a lot of the drafts I'm in, it's not working out as well as that for him to, you know, fall down to that spot. So I haven't been able to get him. We're 2 picks away. We've seen a lot of quarterback movement in this round. The players, you know, by ADP, they'll be going from here on out. It'll be like Dak Prescott, AJ Brown, Garrett Wilson, Puka Nacua, Gibbs, Purdy, Taylor, Barkley. But I think, Shawn, you know, we'll be looking here with 2 picks to go. These guys could get wiped out. But I think Wilson, Nacua, I think for me, Sam Laporta would be the standout pick. I think if we could get him through, the possibility is then that you could, you know, work into the 3rd round. If you do pass it by, you could take your Garrett Wilson here, for example. How much of a priority in this particular format are you putting on the tight end position? And the other one that's there is we're looking at players who could take a jump forward and have that monster season. When we're looking at Bijan and Breece Hall, that would lead you to Jahmyr Gibbs possibly entering the conversation. We are on the clock. Shawn, Travis Kelce did go off the board to the Patrick Mahomes drafter. Which direction do you want to go in? I'm not going to lean too heavily on you to take Sam Laporta here. But that is who I would take. we could take Garrett Wilson and the hope then that maybe Trey McBride comes back. I think this room is going to be well adjusted to what we're trying to do wise in terms of the tight end position. But I'm okay here to go Wilson either. Or Sam Laporta if that's the direction you want to go.
How about Jahmyr Gibbs?
Do you want to go with Gibbs?
I do.
Okay, let's do it. I pushed running back in the last round and I kind of set up the conversation there a second ago. In terms of Gibbs being another player. Maybe, Shawn, this becomes the team of destiny. Who are the guys who are just going to smash this year? That should be what you're doing in every draft, to be honest, but they could make that ascension into the top tier at their position moving forward. Jahmyr Gibbs, Shawn, what's your bold case here that he just is in one of the best offenses in the NFL and that he pushes his running mate to the side?
Yeah, I mean, I was joking with Blair the other day that, this year's draft is basically just Christian McCaffrey, Bijan Robinson, Breece Hall, and then no other backs are viable until you get deep, deep, deep in the draft. One of the reasons why I was pretty interested in Bijan or Breece with our first pick, but this particular format, I really do think you want to have an impact running back. It's a much more balanced format. The tight ends are not quite as important. The receivers are available so late. Now, again, I don't think in an OT draft, we're going to have that exact same dynamic. We're going to want to make sure we get our receivers. But when you look at this format from a big picture perspective, those are the things that you're trying to make sure you lock down. I mean, you really love to get a foundation player at every position with the possibility of actually going 0 QB as opposed to the other positions there. Gibbs is probably the only guy that really fits that criteria, even though in order to hit what you need from him, he's probably going to need to put up huge fantasy points over expected types of numbers. So you're going to need to have the long runs. You're going to need to have just generalized efficiency. You're going to need to have touchdowns. He's the type of player who brings that. You look at Gibbs and Devon Achane. I mean, that's the type of profile. And Gibbs is probably going to get more work. He's probably a more well-rounded player. He maybe doesn't have quite the same long speed simply because Achane is so fast. And yet the big playability from Gibbs is something that you're really only otherwise going to get from a Breece Hall or a Jonathan Taylor, right? So you get the receiving, you get the big plays, you get this Detroit offense that is going to create an absolutely massive number of points from, the team RB perspective. So that helps you out as well, even if you don't get an injury from, and Colm, I'm pausing there because obviously the name, the from is David Montgomery, but we didn't have exactly the run that we wanted coming out of this turn with Laporta, McBride, and Jonathan Taylor all going. One of the things that I was mildly hoping for is that McBride would come back through. His ADP is after our pick. The thing that I think that we can potentially do here would be to reach for a Dalton Kincaid, who seems like he's the other player with massive upside at the tight end position.
I'm good with going with Kincaid. The wide receiver I would go with would be London, but you're kind of reaching similar distances. So we do take. I mentioned to Shawn recently that I did a draft from the 101 where I don't really like to do it, but obviously we're at the 304 here. But at the 301, I did take Kincaid in that particular draft to pair up with Josh Allen. But we do get a turn after we pick Shawn. I kind of had a fear that this might happen. Was Wilson, Brown, Nakua, Sam Laporta, Trey McBride, and then Jonathan Taylor. So I'm not against reaching on it and getting Kincaid. I do think the value of tight end, while you mentioned not as important based on it being the Superflex format, depending on what you do with your second or third quarterback, I do think there's the ability to still play two tight ends, like a second tight end and the flex in it. And even if you're not planning to do that, I think having one of those players that can, ascend and absolutely dominate at the position is vital. So getting one of those elite tight ends is very important. Now, we take him ahead of ADP. Generally, he's going as the tight end 5 at the 402. But the only tight end that hasn't gone yet that would usually go between that would be Mark Andrews at the 311. So I do think we're in a situation where if we hadn't taken him there, Mark Andrews and Dalton Kincaid definitely go before it comes back to us. In a room that is tracking the RotoViz information, listening to our podcast and that, I would expect that Kyle Pitts probably even goes before it gets back to us here. And at that point, if you're looking at, obviously there's the elite tight ends and how far we talk about that going down as we look at it. But really at that point, there is a break, I think, maybe even when you get to the Mark Andrews, Dalton, Kincaid side of it, as to how the tight ends look beyond that. So I think structurally getting Kincaid there, even though it is a slight reach, makes a lot of sense. The other player that I did mention would have been Drake London. You did make the case, with the wide receivers through those kind of a little bit more further down, 4, 5, 6, 7, having a little bit more depth in this format because of the super flex and the tight end premium. In this room, that might be challenging. We might see some of the running backs drop down beyond that point. It is interesting looking at it too, Shawn. We do have the Lamar Jackson drafted take Mark Andrews, so we're having quite a bit of stacking here in the early rounds through it so far. But yeah, I think this is setting up to be a fun team, and it really has set up through those first 3 picks to be, the team of destiny here. We're putting the players that we have been talking about that we really like, but we're assembling them on one single roster. And if they hit in the way that we are hoping this season, Shawn, this team is off to a good start.
And I love your note earlier about the team of destiny drafting. As long as you make the team work structurally, as long as you're using ADP to give you at least some guardrails for mixing your risk with sort of the implied points, the likelihood of getting points from your players, that's how you win tournaments. I mean, you need to draft a team of destiny squad. And it's hard to, especially if you don't have a receiver, it's hard to start out with a more fun roster than CJ Stroud, Jahmyr Gibbs, and Dalton Kincaid.
Yeah, and you mentioned the team of destiny and the guardrails, and I do think it's important to draft with those guardrails, not just going in and doing things that are away out of order, but I do think there is benefits and something that we don't tend to talk about all that much. We say about getting your guys and using the rankings, and the rankings tend to be aggressive versus ADP, but I think you need to have a certain amount of aggressiveness when you're going into these drafts and what you're looking to achieve, and not playing it too safe, because I do think people, especially when you start getting into contests that are a little bit more expensive, if it's the $125 contest, and then if you're jumping into something like the main event, you want you to push the limits, but you also are sometimes drafting a little bit too safe in those situations. So we are going to see how we play things out here throughout the rest of the draft. But one thing that we tend to do, Shawn, is we like to try and push the limits as well. We'll be trying to push the limit for that quarterback too as things move out. That's something, if people haven't heard us talk about it before, we talk a lot about getting one of those elite options that can be a true difference maker, which we talked about why CJ Stroud could be that, and then trying to push that QB2 as far as possible. The win rates and the information in the RotoViz tools have shown that to be quite beneficial, or very, very beneficial over the last 5 to 10 years. So that is something that we will look to play in here. We are seeing kind of a start, Shawn, of wide receivers going off the board. We had the 3 after we picked Gibbs, but then we had Marvin Harrison after we picked Kincaid, Drake London, Chris Olave, Jared Goff went to the Amon-Ra St. Brown drafter. We have Brock Purdy off the board, Kyron Williams, Nico Collins, Deebo Samuel. So it's starting to set up pretty interesting. That Deebo Samuel team is now Jamar Chase, Joe Burrow, Brock Purdy, Deebo Samuel. So we're seeing some interesting teams already through the opening 3 rounds and 3 picks into the second round. I think we're going to have a fun board here to review when it comes back. And I did mention Kyle Pitts earlier in the show. He does go at the 404 in this particular draft, usually goes at the 412. So as the draft progresses, Shawn, I'm sure we'll feel better and better about the little reach there for Dalton Kincaid. I think we're going to feel better as we wait for the 4 picks before it comes back to us. Any prime targets, any priority targets that are available here on the board that you'd really like to see make it back to us here?
Well, Colm, I again just have to make a plug for this as being the very best and most fun format, because as we cruise toward our pick in round 4, Caleb Williams is potentially there. Even with all that we've talked about passing up on quarterbacks, it would be very difficult to not select him at that pick. Derrick Henry and Travis Etienne are both fantastic selections for this specific format, and they're both potentially reasons to have taken Garrett Wilson instead of Jahmyr Gibbs, what you were arguing for there in round 2. But then the types of players that in other formats you're getting at the end of 2, beginning of 3, Brandon Aiyuk, Cooper Kupp, Devontae Smith, Malik Neighbors are all there. And then as we kind of think about wrapping back in round 5, even with it being a different dynamic in the Superflex, adding a George Kittle onto the roster is another piece that would be hard to, look at and bypass when you think about the potential for Kittle to be such a difference maker in this season and certainly in this league, in this format.
Yeah, I agree. I'm very much over the last, I would say, 4 weeks, I've got more and more into drafting George Kittle and feeling really, really comfortable about it. Williams did go. He's the one player in this range. If I had a quarterback already, I would be willing to consider adding to the roster. But he does go 2 picks before, so that conversation has gone to is available. But I would rather go in a different direction at this point. He's somebody in Superflex that I feel is undervalued at his price. But again, when we have one already, I'm happy to continue to move on. Justin Herbert goes 1 pick before us, Shawn. So we are on the clock. We do have a minute to talk through it. In the queue, you have Derrick Henry, Travis Etienne, Brandon Aiyuk, Cooper Kupp, Devontae Smith. I wouldn't be against reaching down here for one of the wide receivers now that we have Gibbs, but if you wanted to go with Etienne, I just feel like we'll have lots of options at running back later in the draft that we don't really need to push that here. I think structurally we'll be able to get that back on track later. How are you feeling about the running backs, the wide receivers? And then we can talk about Kittle hopefully in the 5th round.
Yeah, I'm good passing the running backs, even though I do think that tactically they are pretty good options. For me, it probably comes down to, all 3 of Aiyuk, Kupp, and Smith are pretty compelling here. Kupp would be my favorite, but he also has a bye that's a little bit trickier.
Well, we have 9 seconds left, Shawn, so you're going to have to make a call there. I would go Smith.
So Colm tells me to make the call, and then he gives me the right answer moments after I clicked Brandon Aiyuk. We'll see how that plays out for us. Colm, are you concerned about any of the rhetoric around Brandon Aiyuk currently?
Not really. I feel like the situation with Aiyuk has been that if he didn't get traded by the NFL draft, it's unlikely that he will move. I feel like, a team that's in a true Super Bowl window, like the 49ers, moving on from Aiyuk at this point probably isn't the right decision. We talk in dynasty terms about the perpetual window, maybe to keep that perpetual window open, moving on from a Brandon Aiyuk and then, trying to reinvest those picks and assets in a different way might be a smart way to play it. But I think that they are going to maneuver ahead. I think when you're a head coach who knows that, there's certain windows, and if you look at Kyle Shanahan's been to the Super Bowl multiple times and hasn't been able to win it, I think that you're looking at Christian McCaffrey and how long the rest of his career goes on for. You're at the peak of it now. I think they're going to try and go all in this situation. So I can't see them moving it without being able to get something for this season, which would have led to it had to be done at the draft. With the reports coming out over the last kind of 24 hours that multiple teams did offer considerable amounts for the 49ers wide receiver and Brandon Aiyuk here, but they couldn't get a deal done for it. So I would expect that he is still there this year. You'd rather your players all be happy starting the season, but yeah, I would expect him to be there. And I think we're in a little period of time at the moment with the news cycle where there will be more and more news coming out, but at the moment it's almost like there's news being put out that isn't necessarily news. It's just kind of opinion or thoughts, and some of it's getting blown out of proportion. That's not about the Aiyuk news. That's specifically about what the news that comes out of Denver on a daily basis. But Shawn, Brandon Aiyuk, the one downside to this is I would prefer if we were drafting George Kittle not to have the 2 49ers. But again, you're getting 2 pieces of a very explosive offense, which would be good. So I'm not concerned. Are you concerned?
No, I'm not. I think he's going to be either extremely efficient again with the 49ers, or he'll be a target hog with a different team if he ends up there. Colm, it's pretty difficult to pass on Derrick Henry.
Are you going to go with it then? Yeah.
I don't know. What are your feelings? I think that Cooper Kupp is also a fantastic pick right here.
I would be leaning on the conversation from the last round. I still think that we're going to get the opportunities for running back later in the draft. I think Derrick Henry at this point, though, is also very appealing. He's somebody who is generally going in the the 401. We're into the 504 here. So I'm good if you want to go with Henry. It may be my only Derrick Henry share of the offseason, but Shawn clicks the button.
Well, I mean, it's going to be Derrick Henry putting up 3 touchdowns in week 17 and CJ Stroud battling back to throw for 400 yards and 5 scores. I mean, that's the tournament winning play. If you're going to get Derrick Henry at that price when you picked CJ Stroud to start, I mean, you have to pull the trigger.
That is pretty wild to think about it that way. So yeah, thank you, Shawn, for clicking the button. I will leave any snide comments to the side after that decision. It is the Texans and the Ravens. So if we could get a Texans piece now to go along with Stroud, would be set up magnificently. This is, I believe, a 71 team final, when it gets to that point, which is obviously, when we're looking at correlation and how to get through, isn't as essential as some of those bigger field tournaments. As you advance through this format, one of the things I love is it's 2 teams out of 12. You're in 12 team pods every time throughout the season into the playoffs, 12 teams each time you have to advance through. So makes it, I don't know if it makes it easier, but it makes it feel attainable, Shawn. And that's what I like to see there. Derrick Henry, a round and 4 picks after ADP. I think you have to pick him there. We did take Brandon Aiyuk, so we didn't get George Kittle. So if I had said we'll pass, that was one of the kind of hair splitting things I was doing for the Aiyuk pick. We did see Neighbors go. We seen Devontae Smith go. We also seen Evan Ingram go before George Kittle to the drafter who took Sam Laporta at the 101 spot, who also took Neighbors. Would you rather have Neighbors or Smith over Aiyuk? I think if we look at which one of them could, if we're going with the Stroud, Gibbs, Kincaid theory of monster ascending seasons, I think Neighbors probably fits that bill best out of those guys.
Yeah, and I do have him ranked earlier. And so that is an interesting consideration looking at it. I have him at wide receiver 11, Aiyuk at wide receiver 15.
ADP has them, though, Aiyuk at wide receiver 15, Neighbors 19, Smith 20. So if you were trying to see, in normal draft situations, which might get back to you, probably taking Aiyuk there is the way to play it, but it obviously doesn't come back to us there.
And this is, a minor consideration compared to some other elements. You want to draft the best players and you want to draft the best structure. The 49ers are extremely good. And so you have both that high floor and then you have the weekly upside. So especially in best ball, that combination really works in your favor. But then they also have a week 9 bye. And given that the other week 9 bye is the Pittsburgh Steelers, you have a bye there where if you select a 49ers player, you're probably not going to come through the rest of this draft and be saying, okay, well, now we've got 2 picks from this bye, 3 picks, 4 picks. Colm, you get to a point where it hurts your roster to have selected too many players with the same bye, and it reduces your flexibility. When we're looking there at Cooper Kupp really being the guy I would probably prefer, the Chiefs also have that same bye, as do the Minnesota Vikings. And
does that matter if you don't get any Chiefs on your roster?
It matters a lot less. But one of the things that is so fun right now is that, these guys, when we talk about this contrast between Stroud and Mahomes, and you were looking at where the different players are being drafted, and granted, it does make a difference that Travis Kelce is an additional star for the Chiefs. So it's not just their 3 receivers. But when we're thinking through this, the prices on Brown, Worthy, and Rice they make sense in their own way, but they're pretty crazy from the perspective of if there's a winner, that winner is going to absolutely destroy ADP. And if there are losers, those losers probably are small loss guys who still have the weekly spike potential. So at those prices, how much can you really lose by selecting a Kansas City Chiefs receiver? We'll see how this develops. One of the things that has happened to this point is that we did lose Diggs with pick at the 509. A nice selection by Greg there. Those Chiefs receivers are all still available.
Yeah, they are. And there's a lot of interesting wide receivers. This was something we talked about earlier. The one thing is if this tier of wide receiver comes off the board, the players I'd be looking to, hopefully come back to us here, Shawn, would be Tank Dell, Zay Flowers would fit in. Now, they all are that week 14 as well, but we would be capping week 14 at that particular point. T. Higgins could be in this range, but then you're starting to look into, Aaron Jones, James Conner, Jaden Reed, Jalen Warren, Raheem Mostert, Keenan Allen. And we may turn ourselves in, though, at that point to a kind of a hyper fragile build here with this roster. So that is the one step there of, taking the Derrick Henry pick, which I think at that point I don't really feel we could have passed it up. So we'll see. Zay Flowers does go off the board to the Stephon Diggs drafter as well. So Tank Dell would be my priority to make it to us here. Not overly confident, 3 picks to go. Is he the way you would be looking? And I know you talked through the buys, but I think for this roster, that would probably set aside at week 14 then and moving away from that.
Yeah, I would really love to see that selection make it to us there. He has an ADP in the middle of round 7. The upside with Dell, extremely significant. Just to kind of, tie up that Chiefs discussion until we get to the point where we'll be looking at those guys. Hollywood is in 8. Rashee Rice is in 9. Xavier Worthy is in 10. Again, we expect him to go a little bit earlier today, but it's so easy to get to those guys in this format.
Tank Dell did go, Shawn, 2 picks before us, so we will miss out on him. That leaves us kind of, Joe Mixon goes 1 pick before that. I feel like when we look at the best players here, for me, it would be Walker and Higgins. I think Higgins fits into the team better from the structure perspective. Is there any other names outside of those that you're looking at that you would like to consider drafting here?
Well, one of the things that can happen is that you end up very wide receiver heavy very quickly, in part because this team is probably not going to have the same type of tight end firepower that a lot of the teams do have. And so, because those guys have gone off the board. Now, when we look through here,
I think if you're talking about tight end, I think tight end will get back to us.
Well, no, I'm looking at it from the perspective of, as we draft tight ends in this, they are not going to be the position that we end up heavy on. So they're not going to be taking the spot of receivers and running backs on this squad.
Yeah. So
from that perspective, we'll have an additional pick or 2, maybe even, because the other guys aren't great fits. Now, I mean, Njoku is pretty interesting at this next slot. So I think we, do want to keep an eye on him. He's probably the other guy who is kind of undervalued. But thinking through it and looking at where Higgins tends to go, he's got that ADP in mid-7 as well. Obviously, it would have been great if he had gone instead of Tank Dell there. Kenneth Walker's ADP in the middle of 7. So not a huge need to go out and get that pick in round 6 probably. As we work through here, one of the things that has happened is that you now have at the top of the board, Deshaun Watson is the top guy left by ADP. Rachaad White, number 2. Those players are probably not particularly interesting. A name like James Cook, he would be the guy where if you had pitched him, you could probably make a case there, as his ADP is more in that range. But the QB's falling a little bit, Colm. Probably they're still not players we would be looking at these prices. And I say that having Aaron Rodgers and Baker Mayfield were the two most recent guys to be drafted.
Yeah, they went. Kirk Cousins did go at the 5 or the 605 in this. So all those guys, below their standard ADP. So if you're looking at values, Deshaun Watson does go, and Amari Cooper to the drafter in the 1 spot. So stacking those guys up. But Deshaun Watson isn't somebody who I've drafted at all this year. It'll probably continue to be the case just at his ADP and price. But that could work out, obviously, with the Amari Cooper spike weeks towards the end of last season. We'll see if Jerry Jeudy is available later. So I thought with the drafters here, we had everyone with a tight end. We do get Njoku going to the drafter in the 2nd spot. But I was willing to pass on tight end at that last particular juncture. You mentioned James Cook. It is a team here that we do also have Dalton Kincaid. I was kind of hoping there Jaden Reed would have got to a Shawn. He goes 1 pick before us. I think we're making the bet on Kincaid in this offense. Would put us to a 3rd week 12 bye if we did go with James Cook. So him and White are at the top of the ADP queue, but both players that I'm kind of willing to pass at this juncture. Are you looking to go down as far as a Keenan Allen, or are you looking to take some of the running backs here, for example, an Aaron Jones, who would also fit this team if we're looking for more running back depth?
Yeah, I think that you can go with Keenan Allen here.
I would prefer to go with Allen. What I think is going to happen is, although there will be wide receivers available, the wide receiver position, like by ADP, is getting wiped out. And I think while I'm saying, that's ahead of his ADP, the only wide receivers that are remaining in order, like, you're down at this particular point to Pickens, McLaurin, Godwin, then you're into the range where he goes. So in terms of positional ADP, there's a good chance that we continue to see those players go off the board. The difficulty is then if you don't take T. Higgins and Allen there, you are going to be in the 9th, 10th round where you're starting to look at the likes of James Conner, Jalen Warren, Mostert, and you're going to be falling behind at the wide receiver position. We do have a trio at the moment, though, of Aiyuk, Higgins, and Allen. Obviously we would have loved to get a Tank Dell to come to us, as we mentioned, but how are you feeling about those 3 particular guys? I think it's a pretty interesting group that, if we think back to, last offseason, obviously would have been more expensive than this.
Yeah, and you look at the individual guys, there are reasons that T. Higgins and Keenan Allen are less expensive. But with Higgins, it's mostly his health and Joe Burrow's health. Now, those things do raise some red flags. We don't want to ignore them completely, but you have sort of a peak receiver, a potentially elite quarterback. I mean, Burrow has been a little bit more all over the place maybe than the narrative would suggest, but the upside there is absolutely extreme. Keenan Allen is, possibly the most undervalued player in fantasy. There are obviously ways that it could go wrong, but I think that the problems in this offense, if it's not a dynamic passing offense, really actually give a lot more risk to a DJ Moore and a Rome Odunze than they do to Keenan Allen. And that's not to say that Allen wouldn't be hurt either by the offense being poor or by it being very spread. He would, right? I mean, we want it to be dynamic, and we want him to be the wide receiver 1. But Allen's profile and price allow you a lot of ways to win, even if it doesn't hit this upside outcome. So from that perspective, I think you have to really like it. The other thing there is that, you have that week 7 bye, which again, there are just 2 teams on the week 7. Jalen Tolbert at the end of drafts has been very interesting because he allows you to come back and get a bye that maybe you don't have covered, but to have a week 9 bye and a week 7 bye at receiver, that gives us, again, a lot of flexibility as we navigate the rest of these rounds. And sort of as we're looking at it, you're going to make a lot of picks. And so you're going to have some overlap. It's more overlap by position that we're trying to not get really out of balance on. And so from that perspective as well, if we had to make a week 14 pick, or if we had gotten to make a week 14 pick at receiver where we didn't have one, that would have been much less a concern, obviously, than adding a second early week 14 running back or adding a second week 14 QB at some point. It's disappointing that Tank Dell didn't get to us, because otherwise this team was set up in really, really good fashion. I think, Colm, it kind of comes back then to, the decision we made in round 4, where you're looking at Stephon Diggs, you're saying by ADP, he's going so much later. And yet, if I could swap Brandon Aiyuk and Stephon Diggs on this team, I would do it in a heartbeat.
Yeah, I would do the exact same thing. And it'll be fun to look back at the end, but I do think that that's something that we may have done. But Shawn, realistically, that's a 2.5 round swing. So we did talk about the Aiyuk one, so maybe we would have hoped that he would have still have gotten through, but in hindsight, that might be the way to go. Dallas Goedert has just gone off for the team out of the 6th spot. This is kind of a Daniel Jones range, Shawn, and Rashee Rice goes off 1 pick before us. How are you feeling here about QB2 spot? That's a way we could look here with Daniel Jones. Is there somebody else that's really grabbing your attention that we have to have? You're muted, Shawn.
You have Deontay Johnson in the queue, and with Rashee Rice going there, then Johnson looks like probably the pick to me. And then maybe you have Bryce Young coming back through. I still kind of think that Deontay Johnson and Xavier Worthy might be the way to play, late 8, early 9. But does starting with Johnson work for you?
I'm good with Johnson here. Yep. I think that he is somebody we talked about. You said Allen being underrated. I think in that offense, if that offense takes that leap forward with Bryce Young, I think it's going to be down to Deontay Johnson. That is kind of the piece that pulls it all together for them. So we'll see if that does become the case and if that is what happens. But adding that 4th wide receiver and one that, although if it was a running back, I would be concerned if we were talking about the volume aspect of it. But he is somebody who has consistently drawn volume throughout his career, and I would expect that to happen again this year. You have him and Keenan Allen now added into Aiyuk and Higgins. Start to feel quite comfortable about that wide receiver group. And then you've talked a few times throughout the draft about the bye weeks. There's no crossover between any of our positional guys at the moment. At the minute, we are up to 2 week 14 buys and then 2 week 12 buys. So we're very comfortable across buys, mainly because we didn't get the Texans target, Shawn, that we had hoped. But it opens up the door quite interestingly. And I mentioned the kind of quarterback scenario, but I think we're set up quite interestingly here to see how it all comes together as it works its way back around here, and could potentially even set up for, as you mentioned, Xavier Worthy as well on this roster. But that is a nice one to add in. We do get Jackson Smith and Jigba for that next pick, and then we see Ramondre Stevenson and Terry McLaurin going off the board. Is it a case here our quarterback targets are our normal crew of, if Young doesn't go on this roster, it is Daniel Jones and Bo Nix, and realistically, Young and Jones are, by ADP at the moment, 2 of the top 3, along with David Montgomery in the ADP queue. It's a case that then we're really and truly just into Daniel Jones as a legitimate starter, as a QB2, or sorry, Bo Nix, I meant to say there. If we don't go quarterback at this next pick.
Yeah, that part doesn't bother me at all. There are so many different ways to play the QB position late. And at this point, the drafters are relatively heavy. Even though we saw the QBs fall a little bit, we didn't get the big falls that I thought we might have. Everyone else has at least 2 QBs. We have 3 teams with 3 QBs. You're going to see additional teams take a 3rd QB. If we lose our guys, again, that part doesn't really bother me. Once you get into the final rounds, you can take 3 consecutive backup QBs, and then when you hit on that, you win. And so that part is, I think, relatively straightforward. So what's happened here is Xavier Worthy didn't come through. That part was disappointing. Dabbling in pacifism had taken JSN right after we took Deontay Johnson. So both love the name and the pick. Colm, we're kind of back around here to where
I think quarterback makes sense. Do you have a different name They're all running backs really at this point. The other name, Shawn, Dalton Schultz.
No, Dalton Schultz is not something I can get behind.
It might come if he comes back to us. We'll have to talk about it. But yeah, Dalton Schultz is the tight end I did tease earlier. But yeah, usually not drafting him. But in a CJ Stroud unstacked team, if he falls around below ADP here, maybe he comes into conversation. And as I say that, I can tell that Shawn is hoping and praying that he gets taken here in the next 12 picks before it comes back to us. But we do take Bryce Young. I think that's a very nice 8-9 turn. Like, we're not at the turn, but our turn picks there for Deontay Johnson and Young together, making a bet. And, if that offense is completely misread at this particular point and even goes to the, if they got to mediocre, if they got to middle of the pack, Shawn, this season, those two picks could prove to be a huge win at that particular point of the draft.
Yeah, and that's kind of what we are gambling on.
We're gambling on them being mediocre. That's
right,
what we're
right. You could get a bigger jump because they have added a ton of talent, and adding that talent around Bryce Young will make a big, big difference. So then the other thing we'll get to see is whether or not the new coaching staff is also a difference maker. Because if you add both of those things and Bryce Young can play a little bit, you really need three things there, right? You need the new weapons, you need the coaching staff to work, and you need Bryce Young himself to not be a Zach Wilson, Sam Darnold type of player, because it doesn't really matter too much what you add around someone who just simply can't play quarterback at the NFL level, which again, that's not that derogatory a statement. Even really good QBs can't play it at the NFL level. So that's something we're still looking to see. I didn't feel like that was the pick we had to make because there are still other selections there that are pretty intriguing. Ladd McConkey is not someone I'm drafting a ton of, and yet in the right situation, I think he could be a winner for you. He goes in the very next pick. Rome Odunze, obviously a similar scenario there, especially if you don't have Caleb Williams. It's probably a little bit less appealing to have both Keenan Allen and Odunze, but certainly a pick at this point in time that works. Christian Watson maybe is a little bit trickier with all the buzz around Dontavian Wicks, but if Christian Watson actually came through and was the guy for them, it would be surprising, but it wouldn't be stunning, right? And you're getting a talented receiver late in the draft. Jaylen Warren was the top name that we had in the queue. He's the pick 4 after ours. Then you get a DeAndre Hopkins. The interesting one here and the really big faller is Calvin Ridley. Now, OT listeners are going to know that there are a lot of problems with his profile. And then there are also a lot of questions about the quarterback play. It is a little bit interesting there to get Pat Freiermuth and Brian Thomas as the picks at the turn for the Will Levis drafter. Now, having said that, those picks do make sense, right? Freiermuth is the first tight end for that drafter and is a good value. Brian Thomas is opposite Will Levis in that game. And for me, Brian Thomas is a better pick than Calvin Ridley. So you can certainly see why they would have wanted to go that direction.
Yeah, from a game perspective, game theory, it does make sense there. Calvin Ridley does go one spot after that. I think, Shawn, as Daniel Jones still continues to be available, I would expect him to go before our pick. I am open to all those names, but at the same time, I think that the end point of the draft with the QB2 being Bryce Young with Deontay Johnson will make this team build probably a little bit sounder at the end of it. Obviously there's the names that we do like as we move on beyond through the draft, but the issue becomes in a room where people know what we're going to do. As I say, that Bo Nix goes off the board, you start to get into a situation where you are, although there's paths and players we like later, it becomes very, very thin in terms of the way that works out, and you really start to get into then a position. And I have done this in some draft where you're kind of planning that your super flex spot is used just as a regular flex with, let's say, a tight end, for example. But in this draft, we also haven't set up the accommodation for that to be the case unless we really hit on some of the later tight ends as we move through here. So still quite comfortable with the Young pick. The other thing is Deontay Johnson in the queue, and talked about how much I, like that pick, but JSN or Worthy would regularly be my selection there over Johnson. But again, the Johnson pick worked out with the quarterback pick there as well, but would usually rather have those guys on the roster than Johnson in isolation. Since we did pick, you mentioned some of the names that did go. We've had Harris, Bo Nix, Jordan Addis, and Daniel Jones also went off the board. So we're 2 picks away. Shawn, how are you feeling now about that Bryce Young pick now that quarterback is disappearing?
About the same, right? I mean, if you let Bryce Young go through, then he probably gets picked in one of the spots that Bo Nix or Daniel Jones go. And one of those guys probably makes it to us. I kind of question the Daniel Jones pick there for a drafter that started Lamar Jackson, Jordan Love. If you do that QB start, which the QB start hasn't been that effective recently, but when you look at Lamar Jackson and Jordan Love, you're like, those guys are absolutely fantastic. You could make a case for them in this format at the 101 and like the 106. So when you have them both, I mean, you're all set up. It becomes a nice value pick for them.
Yeah, it's two rounds after ADP.
And the team is balanced here, right? They have Mark Andrews and Jake Ferguson. They got the ADP discount on Saquon Barkley and Josh Jacobs. And then you get 3, interesting names at receiver in Moore, Godwin, and Watson. So you certainly can make the Daniel Jones pick. It just, maybe leaves something else on the table for you. Colm, we've gotten back through. Drake May also goes. I guess for me, this is probably Jameson Williams or Tyjae Spears.
Yeah, and I'm good again to go with Williams. Now we have, just before we make the pick, we're up to the 4 wide receivers, but there is a drop off here after Williams, which I'd be looking then to start going into some of these running backs. Are you seeing it the same way? Are you seeing that drop off coming that we kind of have to go here with the wide receiver?
Yeah, Jameson Williams for me is kind of that transition guy where you have the receivers you can draft. And then you have Jameson Williams right in between where...
And other people may have the transition before Jameson Williams.
Well, but I mean, I think he's the guy, right?
Yeah, especially in best ball, when you're looking at like who could just like one play with him can blow up a game. But you could see him just like taking that step forward this year and just being a monster.
Yeah, I don't think it's that different of a play than drafting, say, a Brian Thomas. Now, when you're talking about 2 years from now, I would expect Brian Thomas to be better simply because he can very easily get to the wide receiver 1 in that offense. And once he's got some experience, all those types of things. But Jameson Williams, I mean, it's a huge concern about volume, but especially in best ball, there are going to be weeks where he scores really well. And then, I mean, this offense should be the best offense in the NFL. They have too much talent. They've got an above average, if not elite QB. They've got a fantastic offensive coordinator. You're playing there on the fast track. I mean, this should be the best offense. And having exposure to it with 2 guys who are ridiculously athletic, and Jahmyr Gibbs and Jameson Williams, when you have that set off with the Brandon Aiyuk piece, I really want to play it that way. And so again, that transition, you've got the guys who are very draftable at receiver. You've got Jameson Williams, who probably doesn't have the volume to really belong, but is a potential spike week star. And then, you're off the cliff where, Cortland Sutton and Jerry Jeudy, I think are interesting names. I think you still can pick them, but everybody else from this spot on, and we're deep into the draft. So it's not like, it's not hugely surprising that the wide receiver profiles change. There is a limit to the number of receivers who can have reasonable profiles, but
the paths become much, much narrower from this point forward.
Exactly. And so I love having that covered. I'm certainly not worried at all about a QB3.
And just to keep listeners up to date, before we had the chance to draft Jameson Williams there, Dalton Schultz did go off the board 2 picks later. So you may even be able to hear joy in Shawn's voice at this point in time that we didn't have to have that conversation.
I think if he had come back to us in round 14, I would have been okay with it.
Okay. That would have matched his bye week as well.
Yeah, so
really like where we're sitting at the moment. Though we are now 2 running backs, 2 quarterbacks, 1 tight end, and the 5 wide receivers. The one thing about taking the Gibbs pick and also the Henry pick, it kind of allowed us to navigate through some of those picks there to not go running back where we normally may have. Luke Musgrave on 1 pick before us, Shawn, could have been potentially interesting. We are back up here, and there's not a huge amount. Like, we're down to Javonte Williams has a week 14 bye. I would be interested in Williams. I'm interested in Singletary, Chase Brown, Blake Corum. I think running back is probably the selection here. Is that the way you want to go? And do you want to go with
I don't know if you saw what I just added, but I mean, I think that TJ Hockenson to win the whole tournament is the play for me.
Let's do Hockenson. I have... That's part of the wonders of modern technology. Shawn, my side did not update the queue with Hockenson involved, so we didn't have that. But that's fun. That is, I think the way to describe that pick is that's a huge amount of fun to set things up here. Adding Hockenson in, if you're looking at realistically, I think we could be looking at the second half of the season before we see anything from him. But we're down into the 11th round at this particular point. Looking at, as we go off the boards, tight end 17, and you talk about transitions from that group. We talk about Musgrave. You could say again, some people would say it's Komet, where there's another transition down in terms of the tiers at tight end. It's definitely a bit like the Williams one, where there's a transition. But if you're talking about upside, that could be absolutely massive. So that's a really fun pick to add in. I haven't drafted much TJ Hockenson. I've seen more conversation around people being completely out on him for this season over the past couple of days. But yeah, Hockenson in a shootout with the Packers maybe in week 17 could be interesting. I haven't been drafting much
behind being completely out on it.
Not
necessarily yours, but just globally.
I would imagine that it's the fact that they're expecting that the injury takes longer to progress. And the second part of that, I'm assuming the majority of it is the quarterback conversations, which I think we've seen in the past. That doesn't really affect TJ Hockenson all that much. So I don't really see any reason to be completely out on Hockenson other than the fact that if his knee is not in good shape and he misses, 12 weeks. But if you're looking at a contest like this, I could see if that was a redraft format. But when we're looking at best ball, you're setting this team up and you're having a shot at a tight end premium format with somebody like TJ Hockenson, who, if he was healthy, would be getting drafted at least up where we're seeing Kyle Pitts getting drafted here, if not in the Mark Andrews tier there.
I just don't see any way he could go lower than tight end 4 if he were.
Yeah. Well, I felt I was being aggressive, Shawn. That was, where did I get to tight end 5? So tight end 4 is fair. For long-term listeners of the show, they'll know that like TJ Hockenson has been kind of my tight end crush over the last few. He was the original Sam Laporta in terms of players that I just wanted to get on every single roster. And I think that the case for him this season is basically injury based and quarterback based. In terms of talent, there's no concerns for me around talent.
So as we head back here.
And sorry, the other point, Shawn, to make is I did say that I haven't been drafting them, but again, people listening to the show will know that I've been pretty extensively drafting 2 of the tight ends prior to getting to that, at least Luke Musgrave range. So he's obviously kind of outside of that range of what I'm trying to do there. But that will be the reason I haven't drafted him, because I did mention that as well. And then I talked about how much I think I like him.
So we did finally get the Javonte Williams pick. There's going to be some trepidation, some fear with the notes that maybe he doesn't make the team. One of the things that I've noted with Javonte Williams is that if he doesn't make the Denver Broncos, he's going to be the starting running back for the Dallas Cowboys. I don't think that your floor for
as
Javonte
long as the
Williams
Cowboys don't have to spend any money to, if the Cowboys have to spend money to get him on the roster, Shawn, that would be the concern.
Colm,
he was
Javonte
the person
Williams
I mentioned
is
at
not the starting
list.
running back for the Denver Broncos or the Dallas Cowboys. He's going to be the starting back for the running back for the Kansas City Chiefs.
Yeah.
Right?
I mentioned at the start about, we talked about the news with Aiyuk. I think the majority of the stuff coming out about Javonte Williams on a weekly basis is just people's opinions. there's like not a huge amount. Then every so often we get a comment from Sean Payton that would, in my opinion, be quite glowing about his starting running back Javonte Williams. But if anyone breathes anything that could be negative, it's really getting the airtime at the moment. So he's a player I would be sending for people to maybe not have as much concern as you see on social media about, because he'll be the starting running back for the Dallas Cowboys.
Exactly.
2 picks away, Shawn. Lots of names in the queue, lots of quarterbacks in the queue, but there's a lot of very interesting running backs here. We've not gone running back since the Derrick Henry Gibbs pick. And again, I mentioned those picks about the kind of run off Deontay Johnson, Young, Williams. That also kind of freed us up to make that Hockenson pick, having that kind of backbone there at the running back position. We are 2 picks away. Charbonnet, I think, would have been very interesting to have here. I mentioned Blake Corum at that last pick, still available here. Obviously, we're not going to draft Rico Dowdle in this draft because Javonte Williams will, take his job in Dallas. Shawn is into that. Marshawn Lloyd is also here, and Shawn, if we're building out that TJ Hockenson week 17 facing off against Marshawn Lloyd, could be fun. Which direction do you want to play here?
Well, I'm just wondering, how much guts you are.
This is a Justin Fields pick, is it?
No, not Justin Fields. We have QBs in the queue to remind ourselves that there are QBs there. Colm, you would know better than I. Nick Chubb. It seems like there are videos circulating where he looks pretty good.
Yeah,
I know he's not. I don't think he's going to play the first 6 weeks. But again,
we don't need him on this roster.
We don't need him.
Shawn, this could be the wildest team of all time. Let's do it. We'll get one of those guys I mentioned on the way back. Shawn, this team is. I really hope this team makes a run and people get to listen back to this, in the playoffs, because there's a bit of wildness to this roster. We're drafting a lot more injury concern than normal, but Shawn's buying into the speculation. Have you seen any of the speculation, Shawn, or is it just that I tell you that there's clips on Twitter of Nick Chubb doing workouts that humans should not be able to do?
I think everybody tells me that.
And speaking of workouts, you missed the last. I don't know if you've seen Derrick Henry and the conversations around how much he spends per season. I think a lot of athletes obviously spend a lot of money on keeping themselves healthy, but yeah, Derrick Henry is probably the king of those workouts that humans should not be capable of.
Colm, I was never interested in Derrick Henry in round 1. Now, again, this is super flex, so it's a little bit different. And I was never interested in Nick Chubb like at the 1-2 turn or early in round 2.
Or the 2-3 turn, let's be honest.
Well, again, if it were super flex. But you're talking about the 2 greatest running backs in terms of pure rushers, right, of the last decade, in Derrick Henry and Nick Chubb, and they're in rounds 5 and 12. Now, again, I mean, Nick Chubb could miss most of the season. One of the things for me, and one of the reasons why I do like having Gibbs and Henry early, we've been joking, but the thing that it allows you to do is that it does allow for this possibility of taking Chubb. Mm-hmm. And you look at some of the other names that are being drafted in the same range. I mean, Zach Charbonnet, I draft him a lot. But, I mean, he's an okay talent behind a really good talent in an offense that may not be that dynamic. We draft Javonte Williams a lot. I just had the huge article about the Denver Broncos running game. But, I mean, he might not even make the team. Blake Corum, if you have a Kyren Williams problem, then, yeah, I mean, he could be a league winner again. Jerome Ford just went. I mean, Jerome Ford's peripherals last year were terrible. I mean, they were really bad. Now, I think that probably overstates how bad Jerome Ford was. If he's the clear starter for the first 10 weeks, he's going to be a very good pick at this point. But when we're talking about anyone in this general range versus what Nick Chubb could be in the final third of the year when you're trying to win the whole thing, because we have those 2 early running backs and we're not having to try and get a bunch of guys who have interesting standalone value, we can make that pick right here. We feel really good about our receivers. We feel really good about our first tight end. We're probably going to get another couple of interesting tight ends. We're going to take, I mean, we waited at QB and still got a guy who could be a breakout candidate for the QB2. one of the things I think we want to do, and you're not like pointing your draft to take TJ Hockenson and Nick Chubb, but if they do fit, I think you want to be aware of the fact that those are not bad prices, right? If your roster is set up to make it. And so I want to at least consider that. As you've mentioned, drafting injured players is very, very risky. I just think those two guys are basically
they're worth the risk
at their position. Yeah. So Colm, we come back through. I mean, for this, to me, it looks like very easily Jaleel McLaughlin. Is there somebody else that I should be?
McLaughlin was who I was thinking. Obviously, it's a bit ahead of ADP, but based on the players that are available, he would be the direction I would like to go. I think that what you're saying, obviously going through it, and we're not, this format kind of allows to target running backs a little bit more based on what I said at the start with the way the flexes are set up. And realistically, we're probably starting Kincaid. Depending on how young season goes, we may be starting one quarterback or two quarterbacks, but then you're starting the wide receivers. But having Gibbs and Henry, which is something that we, the Henry pick, I think, is one that we would potentially often pass on. I could have seen, we took Brandon Aiyuk. You could have taken Travis Etienne there potentially as a player that maybe would be more of a regular target based on ADP for us. But then because you have those two guys and you're not necessarily needing Nick Chubb to be in there from the very start, and now adding McLaughlin, who, although we were joking about Javonte Williams and the concerns around how that backfield is split up, I think both of those guys have standalone value themselves, and then I think one of them will work their way into getting the majority of the work. But I think it's still going to be pretty close to a split between both guys. But you have three running backs that in week one now should have some standalone value. Obviously Gibbs and Henry have a massive amount of that, but even McLaughlin, and then that means that it allows a Nick Chubb to be basically a lottery ticket on your roster that you don't need until he is healthy, which just provides massive upside. So a lot of the teams that we're building aren't going to allow for that to happen. A bit like I talked about, if I'm taking two tight ends out of those first 9 tight ends, it's not really allowing you to come back in then for a Hockenson to add a third tight end, because you're negating the other positions, whether that's wide receiver or whether it's quarterbacks in the window. So I think that the way this team has come together allows those two particular picks, and the Hockenson pick and the Chubb pick, which I think are just a lot of fun. It feels like we're making 18 picks here today for the start of the season, and we have like these two just A+ additions for later in the season with Hockenson and Chubb. And who knows, based on how the injury reports have been for Chubb, maybe we see him much earlier than anticipated, and he's in there pretty early on, and that would obviously be a boost as well. We did, though, Shawn, on that run after the Chubb pick, Blake Corum, you mentioned Ford, he did go, and then Marshawn Lloyd also went. That was at the 12-13 turn. We take McLaughlin, Eckler goes after that, Ty Chandler goes a couple of picks after that, and then we see Gus Edwards going off the board. But a lot of players going in this range that, being honest, I don't really have a huge amount of interest in drafting. Donnie Mitchell, I think, is interesting. Ty Chandler could be interesting. I think Sinat, Jonnu Smith. But I'm trying to have my tight end selections done much before this point. But we are in a situation where we have talked through the Hockenson situation, and we obviously have Kincaid in there. We are going to need this probably to still be up to a 4 tight end team. 3 of those targets of those later tight ends that I would tend to look at would have been Sinat, Jonnu, and Gesicki. They have all gone off the board at that particular juncture. Gesicki, for example, goes at the 1402. By ADP, he generally is going in the mid 16th, Sinat in the mid 15th, Jonnu Smith in the 15th. So we do see a lot of those guys go off couple of rounds before ADP there. Jelani Woods would be somebody who could come into focus. Sanders, Shawn, probably a late tight end. But we're probably going to be trying to push those guys down into the 17th or 18th round. But the likelihood in this draft, just for us to consider, is I would imagine that they're all going to go much, much earlier, probably around 2 rounds ahead of ADP in this particular room. We are 3 picks away, though, Shawn. How are you feeling about how we are structured here? We're now up to 4 running backs, or 3.5 running backs, some may say. We have 1.5 tight ends. How are you feeling about this roster? And what should we be looking to do here?
I love it. I'm fired up for this
I
team.
think this is fun. The one thing we're missing is that part to go with CJ Stroud, but everything else is just so much fun.
So I think we're still in the running back mindset right here. And
there's 3 names that I would go for. Would be Wright, Vidal, or Algier. Are they on your list?
Yeah. And I think that Vital, in part because of the overlap with Gibbs, is maybe my last choice here. Jalen Wright, probably the one to take from an ADP perspective and also a massive upside perspective.
Also, that's the bye week narrative as well, because we would have had Algier in week 12. But I guess we didn't have a running back in week 12 either.
Right. So those 2 picks, I mean, if Algier would come back to us, I think that would be the most exciting development here, because this would allow us to really take advantage of what this format gives you, which is the ability to get the star running backs early without a lot of punishment at the receiver position, and then come back and be able to take someone like a Nick Chubb, but also get multiple 0 RB guys late. Well, one of the things about drafting, even in this type of an OT room, is you're going to see the receivers fall a little bit, but they're still going to be taken, right? And so you go through all of these guys who are beyond the wide receiver cliff, and by simply having your roster set up to where you're probably not going to take any of those players, you're, more or less getting extra picks. And so for me, being able to set up so that we don't need any more receivers other than, say, maybe like a Devontae Walker really late, that allows you to take someone like a Hockenson and a Chubb, because we're still going to be set up for all of that. Now, the interesting thing here, I think, was that Team Venice Beach League 1987, one of our all-time favorites, they did take Justin Fields ahead of us in round 14. That was going to be something that if he made it to us in 14, I was going to pose to you as a possibility. Obviously, the news and rhetoric and everything like that for Fields this offseason has been terrible. And yet in round 14 of a super flex, would that have been a consideration for you?
It would have been, to be honest, Shawn. I don't know if it was the Nick Chubb or the TJ Hockenson pick when you said about, I don't know how risky you want to be. I was 100% convinced that was a pitch for Justin Fields at that point. So he would have fitted in when we have 2 perceived starters ahead of him as well, which is where you would like to add somebody with that upside. Shawn, we can't have all the upside in this draft. We would have had TJ Hockenson, Nick Chubb, and then Justin Fields. Just would not have been fair for the rest of the format. We have 37 seconds left, Shawn. We do see Algier come through there. So I feel like if we get him, we're probably done then at running back, and we can see what we need to do, because we are going to probably need those additional spots then at the tight end spot. We have 5 more selections, to go. Our running back so far: Gibbs, Henry, Chubb, McLaughlin, Wright, Algier. I think that's pretty loaded up. We have Aiyuk, Higgins, Allen, Deontay Johnson, Jameson, Williams at wide receiver. So we have no wide receivers taken since round 10. We have CJ Stroud, Bryce Young, then mixed in as our quarterbacks, and Hockenson and Kincaid at tight end. So we are going to have 16 picks before we make that next selection. How are you feeling, and how should we work through these final rounds to give the maximum upside to this roster?
Yeah, this is one of my favorite teams. So pretty fired up. It's going to be interesting to see who does come to us late, how we want to play those quarterbacks, who our favorite late round options are at tight end. Colm, I like Jatavian Sanders with Bryce Young as one of our QBs. He will be a name to keep an eye on. Tucker Kraft, at least as we draft this on PUP, I think that he's a late tight end who has a bunch of upside in that Green Bay Packers.
So you're looking for TJ Hockenson versus Tucker Kraft. That's
exactly.
The injured tight end bowl.
But we also have a lot of QBs who are still here and potentially have big time value. Sam Darnold seems like he's going to be the Vikings QB for a big chunk of the season. You continue to hear that Aiden O'Connell is the favorite with the Raiders. Some of that is just giving some preference to the incumbent until Gardner Minshew actually does beat him out. But that's an interesting name. Jacoby Brissett is poised to start the season. And then if he plays well, one of the things that has become clearer and clearer and clearer is that going into camp, these things can change very quickly if the young players play well. But going into camp, Drake May and JJ McCarthy are considered to be very developmental quarterbacks when you consider where they were drafted. And if that is the case, the actual starters on those two teams become pretty compelling.
They absolutely do. Shawn's looking at the screen, probably wondering what my facial reactions were for. Jatavian Sanders did go off the board there. I was actually going to say that when we got to him here in round 16, if he got to us, maybe that should be the way we go. He has a lit round 17 ADP, but Shawn, we don't get that decision. We've had a tight end run. We have Jelani Woods, Colby Parkinson, then we had Antonio Gibson, but Sanders, and then Juwan Johnson all going off the board at tight end. So that puts a little bit of pressure on the position. I would imagine that you would have said we would try and push it a little bit further for Sanders, but he would have fitted in, as you mentioned, on this roster. But I do think there is a lot that you said there about the quarterback position, a lot of it in flux, and lots will change potentially pretty swiftly here as we move in. But we could see situations where either rookies are not getting involved and not progressing as quickly as people would want, or maybe it's a case that they're pushed into the spotlight immediately, and then in week one, they are the starter. So lots to look at here as we move forward. But as you mentioned, there's some very interesting names here as we look at the quarterback position moving forward. Although we do miss out on some tight end targets, there is a number of very interesting wide receivers coming up here. And Shawn, we're talking about upside. Maybe we add Quentin Johnson in here to just even add more upside as a potential player to break out moving forward. But we do have the likes of Marvin Mims, Troy Franklin, Devontae Walker that will all be coming up as well. Maybe that little bit down the line for the likes of a Walker. But Mims and Franklin are usually right in this kind of area here. We're one pick away. We get Bateman and Mooney going off the board. Are you looking to move back into the wide receiver position here? I even think if we come away with two wide receivers through these next two picks might be beneficial now that that run of tight ends has taken a lot of those guys away.
Well, I have to say, I was thinking that other than maybe
O'Connell,
Tez Walker at the end, I think we're looking at, probably QB and tight end picks almost exclusively. This to me seems like it's either Sam Darnold or Michael Mayer. And it seems like Darnold is the pick to select first, and that I don't think dabbling in pacifism is as likely to take Mayer.
Let's go. I think I almost default to you when we get to these late rounds because I'm just never as excited at the names here, and it's kind of like, default to those picks, and we'll take them.
Well, Sam Darnold is around 14 ADP, and I think you could argue that he should be in round 12. He's going to be the starting quarterback for the Minnesota Vikings.
But again, the same conversation that you just had about, when they get in there, if we go in and JJ McCarthy looks good, I don't think they'll have much regret in starting him week one.
Maybe not, but one of the things that has been weird that's kind of come out of the draft is that the Minnesota Vikings were not even that high on JJ McCarthy.
They drafted him by default.
They really did. It's a bizarre dynamic there.
And you're comfortable with those, the five wide receivers we have? There's no concern with being short at wide receiver moving forward here?
Not really. I think that there probably will be an option. I do like Mims. I do like Walker. I don't think that we're under that much pressure. And I think we're set up very nicely for the flex spot and for the super flex spot to be covered in a variety of different ways. The receivers, even guys that I really like Mims and Walker, would probably have fairly narrow paths to the type of production that makes them real difference makers. Now, it would have been interesting if Mims had gotten back.
I guess the way I look at it is that if Young doesn't work, this team might be in trouble. But anyway, but if it's a situation where neither of those are going to be our super flex, we may end up then having to use only running back to fill the super flex based on having just the 5 wide receivers, with bye weeks and all those sort of situations coming in. We do miss out on Mims and Franklin, though. We are back up. I do think that tight end here and Mayer does make sense.
So trying to get that great value at QB with Darnold, and then trying to make sure that we do address tight end, because one of the problems was we did have a little bit of a tight end run. I would have really liked to have gotten Ben Sinnott back, or like Gesicki or Likely in round 14. They didn't get there. And then obviously you're looking at Jatavian Sanders and maybe even Jawan Johnson in round 16. They don't come back. It'll be interesting to follow this Raiders offense, because one of the clearest ways that it could develop would be with that Rob Gronkowski, Aaron Hernandez type of dynamic where both tight ends are really scoring. They don't have a lot of additional dynamism. They don't have QBs who, project to being able to attack down the field very well. Mayer is a former really highly ranked tight end prospect who probably was, realistically targeted a little bit more to this year anyway.
He in terms of prospects that have got drafted in the last 5 years, he probably has got the rawest deal out of a high-end prospect to have Bowers land on top of him then the following season.
And you and I are obviously very high on Bowers. We're going to continue to take Bowers. If it ends up that Michael Mayer is the guy, that would be pretty devastating. And yet on rosters where you don't have Brock Bowers and you need a tight end, I think you want to be open to the idea that it's a little bit more split than what we're hoping for, and that Mayer actually emerges as a fantasy viable player, right?
And
I think these two guys could both have volume. I mean, in round 17, after some of the names who have already been drafted, seems a little bit ridiculous for someone of his pedigree.
Yeah, so what I was going to say is he wouldn't be getting drafted here, obviously, if they didn't draft Bowers, but he would kind of fit into that mold of, what we were looking at last year with a Trey McBride, for example, somebody who hadn't really fully hit yet, but could take that jump that would be a top 10 round pick for tight end the following season. Obviously now he's been kind of crushed by the arrival, but that also does, this ADP doesn't dig in to affect the potential outcomes of him still being an impact in this offense. But where he has gone in this particular draft at the moment is tight end 31. So, I think that he's, in terms of actual talent, he's vastly higher than the 31st best tight end in the NFL. It's just that the pathway for him has been a little bit blocked off. We do see after that, though, Shawn, still Tucker Kraft, Zach Ertz go off the board. So tight ends continuing to move here. Daniel Bellinger goes off at the turn as well. So we are in a situation, 3 picks left to go. We now have the 3 quarterbacks, 3 tight ends. Probably, depending on Greg Dulcich goes, Shawn, one of my comedic bits that I like to talk about during drafts. We didn't get to have that conversation. But we are in a situation now where even the likes of Dulcich is usually the tight end 36 in the 20th round. And this particular draft is the tight end 35, but it is at the 1802. So tight end really getting pulled up. And even if you look at even recent ADP, like Darren Waller still is somebody who gets pulled into the 20th round based on where he was going previously. But we're down to realistically nothing at the tight end position. So it probably is a situation here where we could find ourselves in a 3 tight end build, names that are here. Theo Johnson as a rookie could potentially come into the conversation, but there's nothing largely standing out to me. Tyler Higbee, Dawson Knox, Hayden Hurst, Donald Parham. There's not a huge amount to look through there. The Gerald Everett, I guess, is now with the Bears, but he has, a thin path, and Shawn giggles as I mentioned that. So we may be done here at tight end. So we have 3 picks left. We're probably looking to get a 4th quarterback on board here. Devontae Walker also goes, so the wide receivers may become a little bit more scarce here as we move forward. Quentin Johnson, Shawn, how does that sound to you?
It doesn't sound that appealing. I like
DJ Chark might be the pick.
Yeah, DJ Chark is someone I think is undervalued. They've talked
Tolbert
about the
as well.
3 receiver.
Jalen Tolbert.
Yeah, Jalen Tolbert. They've talked about the 3 receiver group. Being Chark, which makes sense. Joshua Palmer, which I would argue, probably doesn't make sense, and McConkey. I don't know. We'll have to see how that part develops. The Chargers
Thielen, Shawn?
is not. No, Colm, you're giving me a lot of names of players that.
Shawn, there's no players left. I think that's the problem.
Well, Jahan Dotson is
Jacoby Brissett.
Like vaguely interesting bounce back. I mean, it's very clearly Jacoby Brissett here.
Yeah,
and that's another player where, I mean, again, Brissett could play for a big chunk of the season. He's below ADP. We need the 4th. I was pretty nervous he was going to be selected all the way through. Jahan Dotson is the pick right before us that goes to Dead Zone Dan. A fun name as always there. Colm, Jacoby Brissett, get our 4th starting QB in a super flex format.
Yeah, I think you want to try and get to 4 if you can in this. It's just I did admit earlier I'm less excited about some drafting the late quarterbacks, but they are the picks then that when it comes to the middle of the season, when if there is quarterback injuries or Bryce Young is struggling, those are the picks that are can push you on through to get you advanced into the dance and into the playoffs. So they're not always the most exciting, but they can be very, very valuable. Jalen Tolbert did go 1 pick later, was kind of considering if he had made it back here. We're now up to the 4 quarterbacks, Shawn. Probably, I wouldn't be looking to go to a 5th. Is that something that you would consider? I mentioned how wiped out tight end is. So we're into a situation with 2 picks left. What directions do you kind of want to go? We've already discovered that you really don't want to draft wide receivers after round 10 in this format.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are names that would have worked. I mean, if you get Mims, if you get Devontae Walker, unfortunately, we're getting a lot of our guys picked there out of the 8 slot. Walker coming back would have been fun. Pearsall would have been a good selection. We get some nice running back picks at the turn from John. You get Tank Bigsby, you get Will Shipley. Had an article come out today on Shipley. I encourage people to check that out. He was actually the name I was going to suggest there. Colin, I mean, we do have Adam Thielen here, which again, simply from...
I never would want to pick Adam Thielen, Shawn, but this may be the roster to do it on.
This may be the roster. You could take Deontay Foreman, which covers you a little bit on that Nick Chubb pick. I mean, once you get to this point in the draft, I don't think you want to worry so much about where you are positionally if you're covered, but simply like what player could potentially add value. One of the names that jumps out to me is Isaac Guerrero. If things fell a certain way, I mean, he's someone who could add a ton of value.
He could. The one pitch I'll make for Thielen that I mentioned I wouldn't want to draft it normally, but he normally goes in the 16th round. We're in the 19th round now. We're on a Deontay Johnson, Bryce Young team. It could make sense to have him added here. That would be the only reason. Then we have Guerrero. I'm good with Guerrero if you wanted to do that. He may come back in the 20th though also.
Yeah, he might.
The other wide receivers, we did talk about Chark, but we've drafted some old players like Nick Chubb in this. Maybe it's the add in that age profile and get Adam Thielen in as well. Oh, Shawn. I'm glad for the listeners just to declare, Shawn, that I don't know if Shawn, did we auto pick that or did you click the button?
We clicked the button on Adam Thielen in round 19. So
normally wide receiver 63. So we're getting him at wide receiver 82. So there is built-in excuses. There's also, if we get a mediocre Carolina Panthers offense, just think of the points, Shawn.
Well, the points should still be 0 because a mediocre Carolina Panthers offense should be Deontay Johnson, Xavier Legette, Jatavian Sanders, Jonathan Brooks, maybe even a little Mingo action. DJ Chark does go with the next pick. I'm disappointed we weren't able to get Will Shipley there. That would have been fun. Yeah. I do agree with you that there's a pretty good chance that Guerendo comes back. That was the thinking by passing him there. I do also think that taking someone like a Sam Howell or a Jake Browning in round 20 works very nicely with this particular team. One of the things that we can do is look at the RotoViz roster construction explorer and get a feel for how these builds have historically worked. When you take that first QB in round 1, you wait until after round 7. Now, obviously, we waited all the way until round 9. The RCE tells us that overall, that's given a 12% win rate. It has very high, top 6% outcomes, very high top 2 percentile outcomes. And interestingly enough, on the small sample, the best overall win rate and the best high-end outcomes do come with a 5 QB build. Not something that I think we need to push for, but something that is a possibility.
Yeah. And I am quite comfortable in the 20th round quite often with those additional quarterback picks. But I think Guerendo would be the more fun, explosive upside play if he makes it back to us. We are 11 picks away. In this format, he generally goes undrafted. We do have, though, for example, I mentioned Will Shipley is usually the last running back drafted at running back 72. He did go, that's in the 20th round. He did go at the 1901 on this. So obviously when you get into these last rounds, things can shift around and people who are drafting players who, could potentially be undrafted or not regularly drafted, things can shake up. 10 picks away though, Shawn, there is a hope for that to happen. But I have to say, I'm very excited about this. This has been a fun draft. I think it's been a little bit more jovial than our normal drafts. It's kind of fallen into a nice pattern here as we've run through it. So pretty excited to see what we do on this final pick as things move on through. And then we will do a brief recap. I do need to find out, Shawn, there is and you can tell me this, maybe this is even out of a movie or something. I did do a quick Google and I could not find it, but we do have a team in this draft, as we'll talk about the listeners after, but we do have a team in number 7 called Bundoran's Finest. I was trying to check if it could be like something out of Dairy Girls or something to that effect, but Bundoran is actually a kind of a town that is 20 minutes drive away from me. So unless the drafter is also from that area that I wasn't aware of, which I'll have to reach out if that is the case, but I seen the name and I thought that was very interesting. Guerendo also goes, Shawn, which is less interesting and more hurtful.
That part is too bad. Yes, I was focusing on trying to figure out the drafter in 7. That's a lot of fun that we have. Hopefully some Irish flair to this draft. Colm, we do have lots of international drafters in the leagues. We have lots of international listeners. We appreciate all of them. I have to give big thanks and congratulations to you as the person who has really made all of that such a big part of RotoViz Overtime. We certainly enjoy having our relationship be international and sharing with the international community. Yeah,
definitely. And I do believe there's a few people from all over the world. I think that we have an Australian drafter in this draft, and it's always interesting to see different people. There's we are starting up our Dynasty League, and one of the things, Shawn, I hadn't shared with you, but was very cool. is that we have a co-manager team in that reached out to me that they have managed multiple FFPC co-manager teams together, but the way that they have found each other was through a RotoViz Overtime Best Ball draft like this here. So they struck up a conversation, whether it was in the chat or that, and they've been, co-managing dynasty teams and so on ever since. So things like that are really cool, and they put into perspective sometimes, what these are, what happens when you put together these things. So I thought that was a cool note. So we are one pick away now. Sean, Sam Howell did go off the board. Joe Flacco went. Theo Johnson went. We do have Davis Allen, Hayden Hurst, Eric Gray, Zay Jones. Zay Jones, I think you and Ben had a good conversation on Zay Jones on Stealing Bananas recently, talking through some of the Cardinal stuff. He could be a fun play now. We added Adam Thielen, so that will be another wide receiver. Give me your pitch here as to who you want to take.
Yeah, I would kind of prefer just to pass on our round 20 pick.
Skip it.
Yeah, skip it. You're
saying you also passed on a round 19 pick as well, I think, with Adam Thielen.
We did. It is entertaining that at this point, the top 3 tight ends by ADP. Is this really possible? It is kind of cracking me up that they are all from the Chargers. Yeah. And so we could potentially take Hayden Hurst, get ourselves that 4th tight end. I've been told that Davis Allen will be the receiving tight end for the Rams, which really, I think, calls some of their decision-making into question, but he would be a possibility with the last pick here. But Zay Jones, I think, is a good selection. Jake Browning is one of those plays where
I do think that even though Hayden Hurst isn't going to be exciting, I think with having Hockenson and Mayer and then, Kincaid, I do think a 4th tight end probably, even though it's going to be a hold your nose style pick, probably makes sense.
Okay, so we'll take Hayden Hurst in round 20.
I will say, Sean, you have to take those discounts. Hayden Hurst normally tight end 30 and round 18, early round 18, 1804. We've just got a bargain there. We've got him at the 2009 as tight end 40. Can you imagine that? Just the value that we've got there.
Just the huge value in round 20 that will probably make the difference for us. Colm, yeah. It's a little bit disappointing to have this extremely aggressive team throttle it down in rounds 19 and 20, making some very boring selections, but not surprisingly, the listeners have done a fantastic job, grabbed up the names that make sense. I do think that this is a fun pick in round 20 from, again, dabbling in passivism right after us, Malik Washington. Yeah. I'm very excited for what he might do with the Miami Dolphins there and some elite upside if you do, and hopefully we don't, but if you do get an injury to either Tyreek Hill or Jalen Waddle. Some good names have coming off in round 20. Joe Flacco goes as the 4th QB for Nick there. His first 2 were Jaden Daniels and Kirk Cousins. He was the Justin Fields drafter as well. We did get Tyler Higbee, Lucas Krull, and Theo Johnson earlier in round 20 at the tight end position. Some injury questions about those guys, but certainly some upside. And again, it's just illustrating kind of where we are in round 20. Trey Tucker goes. That is hopefully a player who doesn't have too much value. I think that there would be some potential overlap. Obviously not in terms of the routes, but in terms of just the total volume that is available. Trey Tucker there being the 3rd receiver for the Las Vegas Raiders, and Darius Slayton is Mr. Irrelevant. We had Isaac Grendo's the first pick in 20, Evan Hull, which I think is a really interesting name. Trey Sermon getting all the buzz right now. I believe in PPR formats that Hull is a better selection, even though it's an awkward selection, perhaps, in that you would expect Anthony Richardson to, maybe not be the best fit for underneath passes to the running backs. Colm, the draft is wrapped up. This has been an absolute blast.
Yeah, this has been awesome. And you mentioned those 2 players. The team in 12 did take Trey Sermon 2 picks before that. Evan Hull picked to the team in 11. So be interesting to track that, during the season in terms of the difference that small gap in terms of those running backs could make to those drafters. You also mentioned the drafter that took Malik Washington out of 3. They also took Quentin Johnson, Jalen Tolbert. They've DeMario Douglas in that roster, but it is a Garrett Wilson, Jaden Reed, Jackson Smith and Jigba, Jerry Jeudy team. So there's a lot of upside in that wide receiver room. Our team, Shawn, though, to finish up, we may look at some of the other teams here in just a second, but CJ Stroud, Bryce Young, Sam Darnold, Jacoby Brissett. Running back is Gibbs, Henry, Chubb, McLaughlin, Wright, then Tyler Algier, and then at tight end, Dalton Kincaid, TJ Hockenson, Michael Mayer, Hayden Hurst, wide receiver, Brandon Aiyuk, T. Higgins, Keenan Allen, Deontay Johnson, Jameson Williams, Adam Thielen. A couple of players in there, Shawn, we wouldn't normally draft, but I think they all fit this roster. You mentioned, the last picks maybe feeling a little bit boring. You could say, from 16 through, where it's Sam Darnold, Mayer, Brissett, Thielen, Hurst, could all be very boring, but they also could be the picks that kind of get you through those weeks that you need. Let's say we have a down week from Dalton Kincaid and Hayden Hurst catches a touchdown. Maybe those points during the season will help you progress. And I am saying that could be 1 week where he catches a touchdown. But we have a pretty fun build, Shawn. And I think that because we have Kincaid, we can hopefully work through. We're making that bet on him that we can make it the rest of the way. And that decision at the time obviously was beneficial. We took him a little bit ahead of ADP, but tight end got wiped out pretty quickly, and we wouldn't have had a huge amount of other opportunities to get one of those elite guys. So I think in hindsight, again, that was the right call. We did talk during the draft that maybe Brandon Aiyuk, that pick at 409, swapping that out for the pick of Stephon Diggs at the 509, that could have worked out better for this roster, but not feeling too bad about the Aiyuk pick. Would rather have an isolation Diggs on the roster. But I think this is a really fun team. Is there any team, Shawn, as we look through here that are really standing out to you, either for uniqueness or for how the team has built out here throughout the entirety of the draft? There's some of these teams that also did take 3 quarterbacks, relatively early. And you talked about the Daniel Jones draft, but that Daniel Jones pick was in the 10th round. But we had another team. We had 3 teams, in fact, in the 10th round get to 3 quarterbacks. One team, though, out of 12 has Anthony Richardson, Matthew Stafford, Will Levis, and JJ McCarthy through 11. So that's quite a different build out of a team. Anything that you want to look at that stands out to you?
Yeah, one of the questions that you always ask yourself in any draft is, where are the tier breaks going to be? What are the tactics that work the best for this specific format? What is ADP, and how is that going to influence those tactics? And then are there any things unique about this particular room that might force you to reconsider or to proactively fight back against either runs or just things that might be globally different because of the group that you're in? So we know with the OT listeners that most of them either have access to the tools or certainly have heard us discuss the Superflex best ball workshops, where we look at how QBs are overvalued in this format. The normal ADP is 16 QBs through round 3. Now, it may seem like it's only a subtle difference, but we don't get to QB 16 until the 409, I believe, 408 in this draft. And so even though they're not falling dramatically, you have an interesting question, which is, okay, let's say I think that QBs are overvalued, but I'm also going to be in a draft that gives me a chance to take unique combinations, to take someone at a bit of a discount. How would I kind of work through that? And so it's interesting to see, as we mentioned kind of at the time, the Lamar Jackson, Jordan Love, QB start. That's the only one in the entire draft. I think that almost certainly is unique to this particular room. But when you look at that, you're thinking, well, that's a fantastic start. So even if we wouldn't necessarily recommend that structurally, I mean, that could be the home run. That could be the thing that wins, the entire tournament. When you think about all of these other teams that don't have a QB start, we also see that only one additional team gets to their second QB in round 3. And that's the team out of 11, which you had mentioned has that sort of fun start with Ja'Marr Chase and Joe Burrow in 1 and 2, and then Brock Purdy and Deebo Samuel in 3 and 4. I think you have to like the way that works. It is interesting because Geno Smith in round 7 as QB 23, that is about a round discount. And that round discount is an interesting one to consider whether or not it's meaningful in this specific room. But it is interesting from the perspective of when they make that decision to take Geno, they have already taken DK Metcalf in round 6. So they know going into it that they're going to be set. That's a little bit of a contrast with some of the things that happen in this format where the QBs go early, and then you're faced with the question of, okay, well, do I reach for my receivers, or do I kind of live with the fact that I don't get my guys? This is very different drafting Stroud in this room versus drafting him in a normal best ball format where you can kind of take 1 or 2 of the interesting Texans receivers early and then watch Stroud. Is he falling? Is he going to get back to a spot that you really like? Yeah. And you can tactically select him at a point where you're getting an ADP value and you have him paired up. That was the thing that was kind of unfortunate in this draft, where Sam did go ahead and thwart us by taking him 2 picks ahead. Tank Dell, that is, specifically 2 picks ahead of our selection in round 6. That's a team that started Lamb Prescott, so you get those 2 guys together. You then have Achane in the middle of 3. He was one of the names that was in the article on the best values in this tournament. So Achane there, you have to like. I love Sam's pick of Caleb Williams in round 4, and then he is able to get Rome Odunze in 9 to go with that. So that's a team that has built there nicely there. The Tank Dell pick, wasn't in any way necessary to make that work, but it wasn't in any way a problem. I mean, they still got the QBs and the receivers to get together on that roster. The part that is interesting here as we look through from a bigger perspective is, how have these QBs then influenced the draft as you go through? How did that tight end run in round 3 influence what happened the rest of the way? And so at 1 and 2, you can kind of expect John and Eric to take Allen and Hurts and then wait. And so the question that they have to ask themselves then is, Baker Mayfield in 6 and Deshaun Watson at the 701, do they like those picks a lot more than what they might have selected in round 9? Now, the interesting guys in Young, Nix, Jones, and May, they didn't come back to them in 10, so they would have had to take them in 9, but that's kind of an interesting question. And it's not necessarily so much a question for them specifically, but just all drafters as we think through what is the gap in your rankings and in your comfort level between the Mayfield Watson tier and that tier that went in the 9-10 range. So I think that part is interesting. But then, Colm, we do have this group that selected the tight ends early, and John was part of it, who took 2 of the tight ends early, because the drafters were pretty aggressive, and because, again, the listeners in this room are going to know that tight end is still very important, but maybe it's like a 1 elite tight end, and then obviously you fill in. But it's a little bit different than the normal one. We only see 1 team take a couple of tight ends. Now, Evan Ingram at the 501 is your tight end too. I really like that. If we could have taken a second tight end in the elite group, I would have loved that. It's one of the reasons I wanted TJ Hockenson, even though we may have to take a 0 on that for 2/3 of the year. Just his upside late, I think, is so extreme.
Yeah.
But the teams that don't get one of the elite tight ends, how do we feel about their chances to cover that up? We talked about a lot of the things that Sam was able to pull off in the first 6 rounds. Part of that is because you don't have the elite tight end, and then you have Dallas Goedert, Dalton Schultz. those are guys who could come through, and ADP suggests that they will. When you think through kind of globally how these guys are being viewed by the fantasy community, if you have both of those players in a tight end premium format, does that probably work? I mean, it probably does. And yet having to take those two guys in there where some of the names are still pretty interesting. I think the Dalton Schultz one, you and I were obviously joking about it. He's not someone I would have necessarily wanted to pick. The question is Jordan Addison, who went a couple picks earlier, we don't really know what's going to happen now with him, but then Jameson Williams that we took 2 picks later. Do you want to get the receivers there before you're hit by the wide receiver cliff, or can you afford to make that tight end detour? Colm, those are some of the things that I'm seeing from this draft from a big picture perspective that I think are really interesting.
Yeah, and I would agree with all of that. And even some of the teams, like we kind of, I said that although it is mainly based maybe on Hockenson, but when you start to get into the round 11, I think from that Hockenson pick, so from Luke Musgrave on, most of these guys you're looking at, you need, like, there's going to be questions. They're not going to give you points all 17 weeks of your fantasy football season. So there's some of the teams, maybe team 11, Whiskey the Dog, they have Hunter Henry, Mike Gesicki, Colby Parkinson, Greg Dulcich. I think that's a quite well paired together room, but there is also a lot of question marks about all of those guys. The least questions are probably on Hunter Henry, which is still in an offense that may not be all that productive, but that's from round 12 on, having 4. I really feel like you might want to try and push it up to 12, but then the team in 12 has Pat Freiermuth, Jelani Woods, and Daniel Bellinger. I think if anything was to happen to a Freiermuth, for example, I think the path of those other 2 guys sustaining this team through the season could be very challenging. And that's the same that I kind of had the thought with Kincaid. I was kind of saying that Hockenson is a player who we're going to have at the end of the season. We still need to sustain points throughout the the accumulative portion of the regular season. The team that has Travis Kelce is just Travis Kelce and Tyler Conklin. And if that was, let's say, a non-tight end premium format, like let's say we're looking at Underdog, maybe you get away with 2 tight ends. I would still probably lean into 3, but when it's Conklin and Kelce, there's, anything happens to either of those guys and you start to get into a little bit of trouble with the cumulative points. So I would rather be adding that additional piece at the end to try and have another tight end on those particular rosters. We have the Brock Bowers team, and we talked about it with Michael Mayer. But as much as we like Bowers, there's still, the rookie part of it that maybe it takes him longer to adapt to the NFL, or let's say picks up an injury. But that is a team that has Juwan Johnson, Tucker Kraft. So the depth of some of these teams, I would be concerned about at the tight end position potentially in a tight end premium format, where I think that really needs to be focused on. Overall, though, Shawn, I think there's a lot of interesting teams here. The Eric's team and 2, that is a Jalen Hurts, AJ Brown, Devontae Smith team all paired up together. But he has Trey McBride, David Njoku, Cole Kmet, Kate Otten. I think that's a really strong tight end room. It's Travis Etienne, Ramondre Stevenson, Tyjae Spears, Blake Corum, Kamani Vidal at running back. And it's Hurts, Mayfield, and then in the second last round, Taysom Hill at quarterback. But the rest of that wide receiver room is Xavier Worthy, Rashid Shaheed, Troy Franklin, Marvin Mims, Ricky Pearsall, and Trey Tucker then in the last round. There's a lot of upside built into that team. I think it's structured quite well, and I think it's a very, very interesting roster. I mentioned the team in 5, that is a Mahomes Kelce team, also has Rashid Rice on that particular roster. So there's some of these teams really well built out. Amon-Ra St. Brown's team is a Jared Goff roster as well. There's some stacked rosters. The Kirk Cousins drafter also has been able to get Drake London on that particular team. So there's some teams, I think there's some good correlation throughout them. If I was picking, though, I do think Eric's team in spot 2 is very, very interesting. The Mayfield pick, maybe you try and push that a little bit further down, but you're probably only going to get away if you want him on your roster, with getting it at the Njoku pick. So you basically end up with the same build. But I think that's quite an interesting team there. But overall, I think most of them, you can look at them and the structure and the build overall is pretty sound on most of them. We can pick at certain spots, but I think it's as we would expect with a RotoViz Overtime listener league, it's a strong draft room.
Yeah, and this is one of my favorite drafts in terms of the experience of it, the fun that we were able to have building our team, the enjoyment of seeing all of the different paths that the listeners took. I want to thank everybody for participating in this league. As Colm has mentioned, if you want to be involved in one in the future, let us know. They are a lot of fun. Historically, drafters from these rooms have done pretty well in the tournament. You're able to create some unique builds. Colm, I can't wait for the season to start. This has got me pretty fired up.
Can't wait for week 17 as we see this team chase that $100,000 prize, Shawn. You mentioned you get to build unique teams, but you are very much, you need to be ready to draft because they are also very challenging, as I mentioned. But that is going to do it for the full edition. If you've listened to the third edition, you'll be hearing us wrap up here, but some people I'm sure have listened to the full draft, approximately 2 hours of conversation between myself and Shawn. Really enjoyed the draft, really enjoyed the conversation. Always a fun time doing these. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at Overtime. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. Check out his work up on rotoviz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.